Hello and welcome to the African Tech Roundup, episode 98. Now, this is where we round up the week's most important tech, digital, and innovation news from across the African continent. My name is Andile Masubu. Thanks for listening in. Now, once again this week, I have a special guest joining me on the show to discuss some of the week's biggest stories and to chat about blockchain tech, as well as cryptocurrency trends on the continent. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you a broadcaster, designer, entrepreneur, and writer who believes that most of us are doing money wrong and is absolutely determined to try and make us fix it. The fintech phenom, that is Simon Dingle. Welcome, Simon.
Andile, how you doing?
Hey, I'm chilled, man. Last time we spoke, I was a guest on your podcast, bud.
That's right. Yeah, you were on that tech show.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really nice to catch up with you, man. But before we carry on, let's do this. This episode of the African Tech Roundup is brought to you by the African Tech Roundup Live. Now, many of you know that the Global Entrepreneurship Congress 2017 is being hosted in Sandton, Johannesburg from Monday, March 13th to Thursday, March 16th. And we're happy to announce that on the morning of the very last day of GEC 2017, that's Thursday, March 16th, I'll be hosting a live 2.5-hour African Tech Roundup special in partnership with the Alpha Code Club and VC for Africa. Now, we've themed the event State of the Startup, and we'll be featuring special guests Olivier Laucher, who's the founder and CEO of Trace, Dominique Collett, Senior Investment Executive at RMI and Alpha Code, Ben White, who's the founder and CEO of VC for Africa, and Daniel Rubenstein, co-founder of My Treasury. Now, light breakfast will be served on arrival at 7:30, but the program itself will run from 8:30 to 11 a.m. So we'll start by unpacking some of the week's biggest headlines. Then, in keeping with the spirit of the Global Entrepreneurship Congress, I'll glean entrepreneurial insights from my guests. I'll ask them to lift the curtain on the realities of launching, growing, and investing in tech startups on the African continent. Then finally, I'm going to host a fireside chat with the one and only Olivier Laucher and have him share how he built Trace from a modest glossy publication to the world's biggest omni-channel urban media group, a group that services a global audience of 200 million people in 11 languages. Now, if that sounds good to you, head over to www.africantechroundup.com/live to apply for a seat at this event. There are only a handful of spots left. And then, of course, if you can't make it, don't worry, because we'll be streaming the event live on Facebook. You can catch the stream at facebook.com/African Tech Roundup, as well as facebook.com/VC for Africa. And that's VC, the number 4, Africa. Are you coming, Simon?
I won't be, unfortunately, but that might have to change.
Heartbroken. Well, I hope plans can change. I know you're traveling a whole lot these days. Really nice to have you there. But with all that said, it's on to this week's news, folks. First up, there's an anonymous messaging website called Saraha. It's the word Sarah, the name Sarah, with the word at the end, but spelled as one word. It's basically the Arabic word for honesty, apparently. And they launched, the site was launched in February this year, and it's doing insanely well. It already has something like 20 million users, with over 2 million users being from Egypt and over 1 million people being from Tunisia. It's crazy stuff, yeah?
That's absolutely crazy. But I've just been looking at the site. It's quite interesting because there seems to be a lot of trust here on the user side. It claims to be safe and secured and encrypted and all the rest of it, but really there's nothing beyond them saying so. If I can make out the loosely Google translated version of the site, which is all in Arabic. There's
basically trust us because we say we're safe.
pretty much.
And so the site was created by a chap named Zain Al Abidin Tawfiq. I hope I'm not butchering his name. Now, he's a programmer from Saudi Arabia. The fun thing is he actually created the platform as something companies might use to get like honest feedback from their employees. And then sort of like launches it live, kind of like the Facebook story, origin story, in the sense that it was initially only for Harvard alums and Harvard students. Then all of a sudden there seems to be this use case for the whole world, which Sarah seems to be turning into.
Yeah, I'm just looking through their privacy policy. I'm obsessed now.
You've been sucked in.
I think we tend in countries where our freedoms are protected, like South Africa. I think we take for granted the kind of frank conversations that we can have out in the open and in public without having to worry about any material consequences. At least not in terms of a government coming for us or being physically harmed.
Yeah.
But when you see people having earnest discussions about, for example, homosexuality from a country where that's something that could get you into a lot of trouble, which is just frankly disgusting in this day and age. But anyway, there has to be a pretty high level of trust in this platform where you're having these discussions.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly encouraging to see this kind of discourse happening in a part of the world that I think needs a lot more of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking homosexuality. I mean, people are sometimes it's even as basic as confessions of romantic attraction, for example, or
I mean, look, we're talking about a particularly evil canon of fairy tales where just not dressing the right way will get you stoned from some quarters of that particular faith. So it's interesting seeing these discussions happen out in the open and people expressing themselves in a way that I suspect, I'm not an expert on the region, but I suspect they don't get to do very often outside of closed physical social circles.
Yeah, and look, the site hasn't been without its critics. Some people have complained that it's also become a platform for online bullying. I mean, I can certainly see how if it offers freedom or anonymity in terms of commenting on people's personalities or politics or government or things like that, could easily be used for less savory things like just out and out being mean to people online.
Yeah, but that's the rough that you have to take with a smooth if you want to build a truly open and decentralized communications network. So, Facebook isn't an example of that. Facebook is very heavily moderated, and there are algorithms that will now even tell us if we're possibly looking at fake news. But this strikes me more as something like Reddit, where you're going to have a more robust conversation.
I was going to
where
say,
the trolls don't get shut down.
I was going to say, in the sort of mainstream, realm of what's already out there, I think Reddit's the closest to that as possible. But even that, I have a feeling is going to be reined in due course, given the direction net neutrality is going or not going, really.
It's already started, right? I mean, Reddit is a commercial endeavor now. It's while it's still some of the internet's most robust conversation. You can already see that starting to happen in a way that it isn't on sites like 4chan, for example. But it's very interesting seeing something. And I noticed Google has made the direct translation of Saraha frankness, the word frankness, which is interesting. So people being frank with each other on the internet in the Arab world without moderation. This is, I suspect you've just killed my productivity for the next week because I'm going to be reading through threads on this site.
Is it going to be a quick deep dive into Arab culture via Sarah?
Well, I'm just, the small glimpse of conversations I've had so far is fascinating.
Fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. Well, to Nigeria now, though, where a consortium of banks, including Guarantee Trust Bank, Access Bank, and Zenith Bank, are set to assume control of Etisalat, Nigeria. This is over a $1.72 billion loan facility dispute that the Nigerian Communications Commission has apparently failed to intervene in. Ooh, scary stuff. Look, I mean, certainly I should have prefaced all that by saying reportedly at this point, because it almost feels unreal that a company that big could be taken over by its creditors.
Yeah, it is a bizarre story. I must admit, it's not something that I know a lot of detail about, but we're starting to see the ramifications of a business that just rapidly expanded on the continent over the last couple of decades, and MTN is a great example of just trailblazing through the continent and winning as much business as possible, and then kind of worrying about stabilizing infrastructure and regulation and all the rest of it in the wake of this massive expansion.
As well, I mean, you've got Bharti Airtel, coming out on we're dialing back on our investments on the continent, a little too far stretched. Perhaps treating Africa like one big country isn't a good idea after all.
Yeah, absolutely not. And you know, again, I think just to stay with my example of MTN, they're a very good example of how they don't treat Africa as one country. They do roll out in very different ways in very different regions. They also, you know, just by virtue of where the market was when they started their African expansion, MTN became the de facto network in some of the, you know, they were the sort of only telecoms network in some regions for a very long time, and they looked more like a Telkom on the surface. If you're a South African, than like a cellular network provider as such. So I think, you know, they have differentiated by market, but my point is just whenever there's a new industry, there's going to be some running roughshod over regulation, stretching the envelope a little bit in terms of what's allowed and what isn't, and there's going to be some structures that are going to be questioned over time. So again, I unfortunately don't have too much detail about this particular story, but I suspect it's another example of a network having to retrospectively go and address some issues that were created.
Well, I mean, so what I know about it is basically that they sourced this funding in 2015. The funding involved a foreign-backed guarantee bond that was meant to finance a major network rehabilitation as well as finance expansion of their operational base in Nigeria. But I imagine the calculations were slightly off because their creditors are claiming that Etisalat has failed to meet their debt servicing obligations since 2016, which simply means they aren't making nearly as much as they thought they might after sort of investing in the infrastructure they borrowed to build. So is this a matter of mismanagement? Could there be issues around the money not doing what it was meant to do, or maybe just straight up miscalculating what they were going to yield from the outlays they put out? Or maybe this is just part and parcel of what Nigeria is going through in terms of the recessionary environment I know that country is going through at the moment. All in all, I mean, I'd be interested. I know, for example, Orange is on the hunt for more acquisitions on the continent. Could this be something they snap up? Who knows? I just find it quite interesting that the mighty are faltering at a significant rate in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, eh?
It's a tough industry, though, Ndile. I mean, as much as the mobile network operators really don't deserve much of our sympathy, they deal in complexity, they treat their customers like crap and all of that. But but it really is a very complex business to run, and it's very difficult. Profit margins are just vanishing. The average revenue per user has just been on a steady decline. The competition in African markets has really hurt the bigger players, but that doesn't mean it's easy to be one of the small guys either. Because if you're third or fourth in a market, in most African markets, that creates a very difficult roadmap for you, and we're seeing that with the Cell Cs of the world. I'm not sure how big Etisalat is in Nigeria compared to its competitors. But it just compounds the problem if you don't already have a massive user base that you're able to prevent churn on.
You're basically the runt of the litter.
Yeah. And Nigeria is an interesting market. I mean, things that we took for granted a long time ago in countries like Kenya and South Africa with sort of interconnect on networks. That's a fairly recent thing comparatively in Nigeria. For the longest time, if your friend was on one network and you on another, you couldn't phone each other, which is one of the reasons that Nigeria is one of the biggest, or was one of the biggest markets for multi-SIM users. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but it's a fascinating market in terms of telecommunications. Yep. It's certainly not an easy one, though. And then the other big thing that you face as an MNO is just ongoing massive infrastructural costs, both in maintenance and in expansion and keeping up with the latest technology. So it's a difficult business, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do profitably.
And I mean, let's be honest. I mean, as consumers, we're becoming more and more demanding in terms of network quality, coverage, and all those kind of things. And again, add that to the mix. You can't blame Etisalat for borrowing large sums of money to basically maintain a network or grow it, or basically keep us happy, keep their customers happy.
We're all human monkeys. We want it to be fast and we want it to be free. It must get better and cost less.
It costs less, and there you are. And it could just be a matter of, again, just an example of how business is just one of the toughest things in the world, really. That's why we don't all do it.
But it's the dynamics are interesting. I mean, just to go back to South Africa, not to harp on about our local situation, but it's the one I'm most familiar with, obviously.
Yeah.
The moment you've got a player like a Cell C or a Telkom Mobile or a third or fourth position player that's willing to take big risks, it really creates a problem for the bigger incumbents, because you'll kind of just insert these crazy price schemes like Telkom has done with its freemie packages in South Africa, and just undercut the market entirely. And for the bigger players to react to that is near impossible without producing some really bad results at the end of the year. So.
Right.
But now what we're starting to see is, if you look at South Africa, like MTN and Vodacom, whereas they used to be quite responsive to what the smaller players were doing, they've kind of just dug their heels in now. So the reaction to Telkom's freemie packages from the big players has kind of been like, nothing.
Go ahead.
We're just going to stick to our guns.
Yeah. You do that while we kind of just do this.
They'll carry on talking about how much better their network is, I suppose, with the idea that you pay a premium for access to a network that's got better coverage and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But it certainly is a fascinating industry.
It is, absolutely. Let's talk VOD news then. This June, the Malaysian subscription-based VOD service iFlix is set to launch in no less than 7 African countries, including Kenya, Nigeria, and of course, South Africa. Now, this follows iFlix raising $90 million worth of funding in a round led by telecommunications giants Liberty Global PLC and the Kuwait-based mobile telco situation, Zain. They're planning to take on Netflix, Naspers, and Kwese on the continent as well as in the Middle East. What do you think, Simon?
Yeah, it's an interesting play, it's I think it's a pretty smart approach, because the way that media consumption works in Africa, and again, not to generalize, but if we do draw some generalizations, is very different from how it happens in sort of North America for one, and then Europe has its own idiosyncrasies. But, for example, in Africa, there's the rate of media consumption on mobile devices is so much higher, right? Because we're just that far ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to mobile computing,
right.
And also, of course, out of necessity, etc. But none of I think if you're a Netflix or a Amazon Prime or any of the bigger on-demand streaming players in the US market, for example, I suspect that you're preoccupied with what's happening in the lounge on ultra high definition television sets that
right.
have a fiber to the home or equivalent connection to it. Whereas
that is like thin as your finger or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas here in Africa, a lot of users are on tiny screens,
mobile first.
Yeah, and often in areas where connectivity is sketchy. So none of the big players are primed for that. It would be interesting to have this discussion with Showmax, because they look more like the Netflixes of the world than they do like something focused on your rural African user, for example. But
I get accused of being like an Econet fanboy, which I kind of am, and consequently a fanboy of many of their subsidiaries like Liquid Telecom and certainly Kwese, who I feel, to the point you were making just now, are probably the closest to the hybrid that I think Africa needs, in that they're making plays for the cable business that DSTV dominates. At the same time, they look poised to leverage Econet's coverage. Well, I suppose we could fairly say modest relative to MTN and Vodacom, maybe on the continent, or Vodafone. But they seem poised to basically leverage Econet's footprint on the continent. They look poised to make the most of Liquid Telecoms now owning the biggest fiber footprint on the continent. And that's not something Showmax can claim, despite their partnerships with Vodacom or Safaricom or whoever it is they're trying to get sweet with, or in fact Netflix or Amazon, who are out and out outsiders,
on the one side, you've got that debate in terms of network partnership and zero rating of content, etc. On the other side is the billing debacle, because if I was going to come up with a truly African play at streaming media, the first discussion I would try and have with an MNO would be in terms of airtime billing. Something that BlackBerry successfully did for their App Store, for example, where you could use airtime to pay for apps. So if I was reading the Tech Central article on iFlix that broke this week, and based on the Malaysian pricing, they estimated, I think they said around 23 Rand for your monthly subscription to iFlix. Now, compared to Netflix or Showmax, that's cheap. It's roughly 25% of what you're paying for those other services. But it's still relatively expensive, for if you look at the mass mobile market in Africa.
Yeah.
And I suspect that a massive differentiator would be if you could get airtime billing for that. So just remove that friction for the end user, where they can hit a button and the billing will be taken care of by the carrier. Now, if I was an MNO, I would also be beating down their door for this, because your biggest problem as a mobile network operator, as we alluded to earlier, is churn. And if you've got somebody's subscription to a media service that they love attached to their SIM card, then you've got another vector to work on against churn. So,
but then
it'd be interesting to see that kind of thing happening.
But then, if you're a media player, the question is, is there any sort of benefit to you in signing exclusive deals with an MNO? When going agnostic is probably where it should be, and you've got the potential to sort of grow into that space without them,
Yeah, I suppose that's part of the discussion. If we go back to our BlackBerry example, and again they had a unique relationship with the MNOs, but they were able to do it across networks. So it didn't really matter which network you were on. You could use carrier billing to pay for things on the BlackBerry store. So, it can be done, but obviously these deals take a hell of a lot of time, and there's a lot of politics involved, etc. It's just interesting to me to think about the kind of model that works in Africa. African users, again, if we generalize and look at the mass market, African users tend to think a lot more about how much bandwidth they're consuming than people in the rest of the world that pay flat rates for unlimited usage. For somebody in a lot of Africa people in a lot of Africa to download apps, they think a lot about how big that app is and how much of their bandwidth it's going to consume. So on the one hand, they're used to paying by the megabyte, for example, but on the other hand, we haven't really seen a super successful all-you-can-eat package launched in Africa, unfortunately, because it's just more convenient for the big greedy MNOs and their ilk to milk the market for as much as possible. But it would be interesting to see.
We're not even all the way there yet in terms of like smartphone penetration. I mean, we're still at best. I mean, if we're talking in the case of South Africa, at like 4.5. I think this is Pew Research Center, findings that put the best possible scenario in terms of smartphone penetration at 4.5 odd smartphones per every 10 people, relative to South Korea, which is sitting at something like 9 per every 10. You know what I'm saying? So even the economics of it might not be all the way there yet for those kind of packages to work.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting journey to watch from the sidelines.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Oliver Fortain, I think is his name. He former CEO of BT Africa. Snapped up by MTN, by the MTN group some months ago. But anyway, I remember speaking to him. Was it last year? Putting to him a very unfair question. I asked him what could possibly disrupt BT's business. To the extent of say they're no longer existing like Kodak. What could possibly happen? And he said to me then that the biggest threat in his mind was BT failing to get media right, which I think is quite telling. And it was just also why I'm quite bullish on the potential for something like Kwese, which isn't sort of, isn't quite frankly, I think best in breed in as far as the content offering they have and everything else when you compare it with maybe a Showmax and iFlix or Netflix. But I just sense that they have the makings of a secret sauce that could actually, make a hybrid that really works for our markets, for African markets.
Yeah, although I'm not a proponent of networks doing services, I really do think that they should double down on being the plumbers that they are.
Really?
And
that's surprising.
Absolutely. For the longest time, we've watched these guys floundering in the services space, trying to do things that they're crap at, frankly, like compete with WhatsApp or compete with a streaming media service. Or, firstly, they're not in that business. They don't have the kind of values and the kind of attitude that you need to run those services-based businesses. They're never going to compete with an agile team of people in a San Francisco or a Cape Town or a Nairobi that are very focused on their customers and are able to do things at a greater degree of risk and at 10 times the speed and fidelity that these big network operators can. And I remember actually having this conversation with Alan, not Craig, senior, of course, when he was CEO of Cell C, when he re-entered the market. And he actually agreed with me. He said the networks really need to focus on what they do, which is being networks, right? Be the plumbing. You don't want your plumber to make toilets. You want your plumber to install pipes and run the pipes very well. And so I really think that the MNOs need to double down on differentiating in terms of network and pricing and the things that consumers want them for, and get out of the way in terms of services and just enable services on their platforms with things like carrier billing. The other thing is it's better for the consumer, because if you're a network with a particular service that's doing well in a market, you're going to defend it, and it could lead to anti-competitive behavior. For example, we've seen big MNOs in Africa trying to clamp down on WhatsApp, and in fact going and trying to get regulators to rule on the legitimacy of an app like WhatsApp. Now, that's despicable behavior. It's anti-competitive. It's anti-consumer. It basically is, again, we're not talking about the world's most ethical human beings here, but it just doesn't. We don't want it from them, firstly, and they can't do it, secondly. And I think it's just better if those services are different or kept as far away from the MNOs as possible.
You've got me thinking, because I had a conversation with the CEO of a subsidiary of Vodacom's, an IoT subsidiary called Mezzanine, and it was curious to me that when I was chasing the opportunity to interview him, he was sold as the Vodacom CEO or the CEO or the MD of Vodacom's IoT business, right?
Dion Liebenberg.
Is it? No, what's his name? No, it wasn't Dion. What's his name? Can't get his name.
Okay, well,
Jacques De Vos. Jacques De Vos.
Okay.
Jacques De Vos. And so I'm speaking to him. I'll probably share some of that content in the week, in another week or two. But I'm speaking to him about IoT and everything. But it occurred to me that maybe that's how big players like Vodacom or MTN or whatever can successfully participate if they secure sort of majority interest or major interest in companies that have been doing it well or have been doing well in a certain space, and give them at least enough room to keep being great without snuffing it out with their sort of brand sensibilities, Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's the way forward to do it. I don't know. And I hear you with regards to the Econet group. I do sense that everything happening around Question, and I speak totally outside of knowing anything about how it's working. I just sheerly covering the news. We've been putting just sheerly covering the company. In the last few months. You just get a sense that maybe it could work if you had all the ingredients in the right place. But again, like you mentioned, you have to have the right attitude too.
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't know Kwese, but if let's say it's successful and iFlix launches, if you're running the network, you could throttle or do other anti-competitive things to make sure that iFlix doesn't compete with one of your products. Now, a lot of that anti-competitive behavior the regulator wouldn't allow, fortunately. But it's a discussion I'd rather that we weren't having. Keep
it separate so we know who's who. Let whoever's good at being good at that be good at that. If you're a plumber, be a plumber. I get you.
And use the services to differentiate in other ways. So, for example, back to the Telkom FreeMe products, Telkom has done a magnificent job of exactly what we're talking about, recognizing what customers want, which is more data and to pay less for it, and then going and working, instead of trying to work against the third-party service providers, using them as a differentiator. So, for example, if you have a Telkom FreeMe package, they zero-rate WhatsApp. So you effectively get free messaging and free calling on WhatsApp if you're a Telkom FreeMe customer. Now they've actually turned a situation around where WhatsApp could be perceived as a competitor. They're actually using WhatsApp as a competitive differentiator. Now that's smart. Whereas trying to launch your own WhatsApp competitor and failing miserably is stupid, and that's the kind of thing that MNOs more often than not will try and do.
Great point. You got me thinking there, but well, I mean, let's keep talking about the MNOs. At least one in particular, MTN South Africa announcing, rather surprisingly, that their CEO Mteto Nyati will be leaving the company and starting a new role as the head of the Altron Group in July 2017. How's that for some news?
I think that's great news for Altron. I mean, you really can't ask for a better CEO
He's
in
an incredible
Africa.
guy.
And
he's
the
an incredible guy.
And the kind of experience that Mteto Nyati has as well, that's a massive win for Altron. Yeah. Whether or not this is a win for Mteto Nyati, I'm not so sure.
Actually, for our listeners who are not familiar with the Altron Group, well, they're a major tech group listed on the JSE. I believe they're family-owned, South African tech company.
Yeah, the Fenter family.
Yeah, effectively. But
the Fenter family, of course, is the story of Altron, but it's a publicly listed company, has been for years.
Oh, yeah.
There's actually a double listing. So Altech, which forms part of Altron, is listed separately and houses the group's sort of high-tech companies.
Right.
Like their cellular service providership, etc. And was a bit of a darling for a very long time with investors. Altech really had a fantastic decade. But the group wise, I think there's some very interesting challenges both being faced now and on the horizon. That have more to do with the industry and the market than Altron as a company. I think it's just if I was Mteto Nyati, this is a very different game from running an MTN. So he's the right guy to lead them into this uncertain future, but it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think a lot of their woes were linked to how heavily reliant they were on the legacy, the traditional legacy model of mobile telcos, which of course, I mean, they had like huge interest in the contract business as far as mobile telephony and that kind of thing. But like you say, I think in some respects his attitude might be the same. Having spoken to him like just over a year ago, I remember him saying that he one of his goals was for MTN not to the MTN of the future not to be just a mobile telco, but to be like a going digital concern, a platform, rich enough to basically cater to the future digital needs of their current customer base. Everything you hate, but that was his goal. That was his goal. The idea that he could see that the numbers were pointing to a future that if they didn't sort of change course and stop relying on sweating legacy assets in the way they had done before, they might very well not exist going forward. And maybe in some respect, that's true for the Altron Group, just from a totally different perspective. Yeah. Nonetheless, Godfrey Motsa will take over from the 13th of March as CEO of MTN South Africa. He's been with the company just over a year now. He's been a vice president of the group's Southern and East African operation. So they reckon he's ready to take the reins there. I guess this is only fair, though, that they lose a major exec, MTN. What after poaching major names from Barclays Africa, BT Africa, Vodacom last year. Yeah.
I don't know if this was a poach. Again, I kind of have to be careful how far out on the limb I go here, because I'm very out of touch with the industry. I've kind of been focused on my startups for the last 5 years. So.
Yeah.
But MTN did report a massive annual loss recently, which I believe is its first ever.
Yes, first ever.
Yeah, what was it, $100 million in that region?
Look, they're blaming it on the whole Nigerian situation. Mostly anyway.
Sure, where they've had to pay a fine.
And that's all looking uncertain. And they're meant to be listing in Nigeria, but that's proving challenging as well. And the politics there, just it's the gift that keeps on giving, in as far as hell for them, it seems.
So, if I just apply Occam's razor here, you've got a big multinational telecommunications player that's made its first loss ever in the same month that the CEO resigns.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, he's CEO of the South African business. In fact, there was this huge political furore around him not being appointed to group CEO. When the last one left, there was a lot of people who felt he had certainly proved himself, not just at MTN for as long as he'd been there, but at Microsoft and everything he'd done before, Microsoft Africa and so on. And people just felt, it was really a massive snub for him not to get that seat.
I see. That's the perspective I didn't have.
See, I would hazard that perhaps that's a seat that he might believe, and I speak very carefully here. I can totally see how someone of his stature might believe that he ought to be controlling the vision of this company right from the top, and not from second tier, where he really can't shape the vision. And I'm saying this based on having had conversations with him and understanding how deeply seated some of his beliefs are in terms of what MTN was and wasn't doing right,
Yeah, and I suppose we also shouldn't conflate the performance of the group with what's happening in South Africa. I haven't looked at the numbers for South Africa in particular. It might be a massive success. I don't know.
Yeah, South Africa's ticking along, but in context, the disaster they're having up north has just sort of taken the shine off anything they're doing anywhere else on the continent. So, and in fairness, you never know what the deal is, yeah? It also comes down to supply and demand with skills and expertise oftentimes. And I imagine for the right situation, the right number, the right sort of circumstances, the right trust from a good board, the right confidence of a chairman can certainly sway someone in a career direction we'd all never seen coming.
Absolutely. And, again, from the sidelines, watching Mteto Anyati's career has been great. I've also had the pleasure of chatting to him, not recently, back when I was still in it. I've just always thought he was a great guy. So congratulations to him, and well done to Ultron, because I think they bagged a winner.
No, they bagged a good one. I certainly believe so too. Now, listen, one last story before we hop into a chat that I've been looking forward to having with you about Bitcoin and blockchain tech and all that. But let's talk some of these allegations that have been put forward by WikiLeaks, claiming that the CIA uses hacker malware to basically infect iPhone and Android devices with the view to hacking, quote unquote, encrypted message apps such as Signal and WhatsApp, the apps that we consider to be foolproof, sort of secure and all the rest of it. How surprised are you, firstly, that these allegations are being made, and what do you sense the likelihood of them being true, given what we already know the US government does in terms of surveillance?
So, just given the sheer stupidity of the people we're talking about, none of this surprises me. Of course they have these tools, and of course they think that you can hack an encrypted system that in fact you can't. So, the software that they use kind of targets the operating system level. It targets Android and iOS on Apple's devices, desktop operating systems like Linux and Windows, and including firmware on things like routers and smart TVs. So really, any device that's connected to the internet, there's a team working on I'm going to call it malware, because it is, that they can install and use to compromise the device. However, I think if we're talking about Signal and WhatsApp as two examples, the end-to-end encryption that those apps use would be beyond just about any software. I mean, we really are talking when you get into the realm of encryption, you're talking about very hardened mathematics. It takes sheer compute power to crack. And I can't imagine a way that this kind of software would compromise a Signal, for example, that has very robust encryption and more importantly, end-to-end encryption. So nothing's been sent out in the open. So, it wouldn't surprise me if you told me that just about every smartphone in the world had some form of CIA hacking tool installed on it right now. But I would be very surprised if they were able to use that to actually do anything meaningful in terms of surveying a conversation on a Signal or a WhatsApp, for example. Now, if you're talking on Google Allo, where things are by default sent out in the open and there's no end-to-end encryption, then yeah, sure, they absolutely can read that stuff. Anybody can read that stuff. The 15-year-old with a computer and the right tools sitting on the same Wi-Fi network as you would be able to read what you were doing. But that's the risk you take if you're not employing encryption. The moment things become encrypted, it's a whole different ballgame.
Well, thanks for that technical insight, because I wasn't aware of that. And I imagine this is a story more or less because of like the technical aspects, which thank you for schooling me on. But and more for the sort of maybe ethical, dare I say, moral issues around, governments basically snooping on citizens and perhaps even foreign governments and so on. And I think that's probably what's gotten everyone going, what? Do they really do that? Well, firstly, of course they do. And maybe in a sense, there was no bubble burst for me in as far as, me, and what I've come to expect from governments in general, and certainly the CIA. Yeah.
So, I think that it's just an important note to anybody listening to this conversation that we're in the middle of a war right now for our rights. And you owe it to yourself and everybody you're communicating with to turn on encryption on all of your devices and make sure that you're using encrypted communications across the board. And there are a few very easy ways you can do that. But firstly, just to address the misconception of I'm not doing anything wrong, so why should I hide? It's not about that, right? It's about a movement in society and culture with governments overreaching, thinking that they have a right to come into your private life and see what's going on, and you might not be doing anything wrong now, but if a new regime takes power, and it's scary what's happening in the United States now, for example, then you might be doing something wrong according to whoever happens to be next
to somebody's
in power.
Standard. Yeah.
If you were a Jewish businessman in Berlin in 1930, you weren't doing anything wrong until the regime change that came 10 years later.
And you're like, oh, you were born. We have a problem with that.
Exactly. So,
So
it's not about whether or not you're doing anything wrong. It's about what we decide to allow society. So, firstly, if you're using an iPhone, awesome, because it's hardware encrypted out of the box. The entire operating system and all of your files are encrypted out of the box. Most modern Android devices, if they're running the latest version of Android, are doing that as well. But you also need to make sure that your communications are encrypted. WhatsApp is fantastic because it's got very good end-to-end encryption. Signal is very good end-to-end encryption using open standards. Telegram's often mentioned as the poster child for encrypted instant messaging. However, because they've written their own encryption that they've cooked up themselves, and there are a lot of questions about it, it's actually probably behind WhatsApp and Signal now. The other thing you can do, and this is something everybody should be doing, is if you've got a website, even if it's just a blog, you should get a secure certificate and you should set up HTTPS on your website so that everybody who comes to your website has an encrypted connection and nobody can snoop on them, for example, leaving comments, etc., or the content that they're consuming. It's become extremely easy to do, and I just recommend that anybody with a website do that as well. And then make sure that your desktop operating system is encrypted as well. So, for example, if you're using a Mac, OS X isn't encrypted out of the box, but if you go into your security settings, you can very easily turn it on by going to security and privacy and ticking a box. Of course, this does mean that there's extra compute power going into unencrypting files every time you access them, but the technology's become so good that you won't even notice it happening. But I think this is something we should all be thinking about now.
Wow, fantastic tips and a great way to sort of round up our news segment. Yeah, I love chatting with you because you're easily one of the smartest people I know, especially when it comes to.
Geez, you don't know a lot of smart people then.
No. I meet a whole bunch, and generally, I have to say, my Rolodex is pretty tight. So,
Sure it is.
so no, you're in good company. But nah, really, thanks for that.
Cool.
Let's talk about two things actually that fascinating me at the moment. Some making headlines in the last week or so, probably 10 days or so, is the fact that Bitcoin seems steadily becoming what some are calling a legitimate asset class, and people point to its the stabilization of its price, the far less volatility. To say nothing of its mainstream adoption, and just it's coming out of the underground, as it were. But then this past week, also the fact that it's the price of Bitcoin seemed to catch up with the gold price. Now, I read a couple of think pieces that didn't leave me anywhere near understanding the significance or the lack thereof of that news. But I thought I'd put it to you and say, is Bitcoin becoming a sort of serious asset class, and not something, not a flash in the pan? And how significant is its price in relation to other commodities?
Let's start with the second question first. So it's the significance of the Bitcoin price reaching parity with an ounce of gold in the real world is utterly meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. A Bitcoin is a store of value in a blockchain, and we can talk a little bit more about the technology if you want to. It's bits effectively in storage or in encrypted storage versus some shiny rock that you find in the ground on our planet that is prolific in the universe. It's not even that rare. just here on Earth, it sort of is. So comparing the price of the two is utterly meaningless. However, there's a perception impact. So, people think about gold as the safe haven, as the ultimate commodity. We used to have the gold price that all of our currency was based on. So I think in terms of market perceptions, it's firstly a good way for news websites to grab clicks because it grabs attention. But it's outside of the perceptions with people going, wow, this Bitcoin thing is serious, and look, I can compare it mentally with gold now. In reality, it's kind of meaningless. But in terms of your other question about it becoming a serious asset class, to me, it has been for quite some time. Unfortunately, I don't think the days of volatility are over. Bitcoin still has a lot of hurdles to cross. For example, at the time of recording, we're waiting to find out whether or not the SEC in the United States will approve the first Bitcoin ETF in the American market. So the Winklevoss brothers, those twins who claim to have invented Facebook, they're now in the Bitcoin space. Luckily, they haven't claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto yet, but they're trying to get the first ETF off the ground that'll make it easier for regular investors in North America to invest in Bitcoin. And if that is approved by the SEC, it's going to send the price skyrocketing. Of course, if the SEC doesn't approve it, though, then we're probably going to see the price drop again. And because adoption is still so small relative to the rest of the market, there's compared to sort of equities and other commodities, there really are only a handful of people actively trading Bitcoin on a daily basis. So that small group of people can send the price, just spiraling out of control based on their actions. So before we see true stability in the Bitcoin price, we need a lot more adoption. We need to clear hurdles and we also need to deal with the fact that people think that an ETF announcement is important. There are varying opinions on that one. And then the other thing, of course, is scaling Bitcoin. Bitcoin has a scaling problem at the moment. It's fairly limited in terms of how many transactions can be processed over time compared to a network like Visa, where it can process thousands of transactions per minute or whatever it is.
In other words, if we all adopted Bitcoin overnight, we all agreed on its value, Reserve banks accepted it, and like overnight that happened, we'd have a problem still because capacity is not where it should be in terms of processing transactions.
Well, so yeah, it would just become really slow. So at the moment, it takes just anything from a few seconds to like half an hour for a Bitcoin transaction to take place.
Half an hour?
But remember, Andile, that's faster than anything else in the world. When you swipe your credit card, you get an SMS immediately to tell you that the funds have been reserved. But the transaction can take days. It can sometimes take weeks.
I see.
So there's a misconception that banks are able to transfer money faster. They absolutely aren't. And if we're talking about foreign remittance, well, the banks can take 2 weeks to get money from one country to another. So Bitcoin is already way faster than anything else that's available. But it does have this scaling issue. And when we start writing other things into the blockchain, because of course the other thing that it gives us is the ability to write any contract, any transfer of value, any statement of trust, etc. We can do that all in the blockchain. Once you start adding the overload of those extra bits that need to be assigned to a block, then the block size debate becomes more and more relevant. So this is a technical problem that we know how to solve. The question isn't whether or not the Bitcoin community can solve this, but rather how, because it's become quite an ugly philosophical battle between the people who want to stick to Satoshi Nakamoto, of course, who's the founder of Bitcoin, you could say, or the person who wrote the white paper and was involved in the development of Bitcoin in the early days. Nobody knows who this person is. It's a pseudonymous character. But some of the solutions on the table for scaling Bitcoin would mean veering away sort of ethically and philosophically from some of the things that Satoshi Nakamoto had in that white paper. So, you've got purists who will kick against that. And then once they've agreed on whether or not this is in line with the vision for Bitcoin, they then have to agree to the best technical implementation. And it's just been an absolute mess of infighting and opinions and personal agendas. And so technically, Bitcoin doesn't have a problem.
A problem which gold, for example, doesn't have as a
well,
problem.
I suppose, it's got its own form of it. Human nature enters these things in interesting ways. But it's just a really long-winded way of explaining that Bitcoin doesn't have a technical scaling problem as such. It really has a philosophical and community problem in terms of implementation. But it'll get over that too. The point I'm trying to make is just that I don't think the days of volatility are over. So Bitcoin's still going to be very volatile for quite a long time.
So in terms of volatility, you don't reckon we're out of the woods yet in as far as volatility or the lack thereof helping to validate Bitcoin as an asset class?
Yeah, so again, we've got this scaling problem that the Bitcoin community faces, and this ethical and philosophical battle that's waging between the various camps in terms of how we solve it. Technically, it's not a problem for Bitcoin as such, but it's going to create a lot of volatility until one of these technical implementations is implemented, which might mean that we see a forking and sort of an alternative chain emerging that some people flock to, etc. So it's still going to be messy, I think, in the short to medium term.
And I reckon, that's a great segue into my next question, around the mainstream adoption of blockchain technology in general. Now, you've got decidedly different attitudes towards blockchain technology and cryptocurrency in general when you think of, say, the Central Bank of Kenya, the Central Bank of Nigeria, and perhaps the Reserve Bank of South Africa, which I'd consider three of perhaps the leading, reserve or central banks on the continent. You see in Kenya and Nigeria this, decidedly hostile attitude towards cryptocurrency, firstly, and almost an indifferent, approach or attitude towards blockchain technology. Whereas in South Africa, you've got this fanning out we're seeing on the part of South Africa's Reserve Bank, experiments using blockchain technology, running on Ethereum, statements being put out saying we wouldn't be averse to rolling out a parallel e-currency, alongside the rand, similar to Tunisia. What do you make of all those things? I mean, in the context of the sort of controversy surrounding Bitcoin and its community, where does that leave the mainstream sort of financial fraternity in as far as adopting these technologies as part of everyday life?
Look, I think Bitcoin's woes aside, blockchain technology is something that a lot of, you mentioned Tunisia, for example, which is the first country that has actually said it's definitely going to roll out a sovereign blockchain and basically convert the country's currency into a blockchain-backed currency, into a cryptocurrency. We're also seeing Senegal, for example, has intentions of doing so, and there's a discussion happening at the South African Reserve Bank as well, although they haven't said anything officially yet in terms of where that discussion is heading. Those discussions carry on unhindered, and really, if you talk about what blockchain offers as a ledger system, that's something that can happen and doesn't really have an impact or is impacted by what's going on in the Bitcoin world. I mean, obviously there will be perceptions, etc., but just technically, as a technical implementation, what's happening in terms of Bitcoin's potential forking, etc., that's not something that these reserve banks should necessarily be too worried about. It certainly doesn't invalidate the technology. We've already reached the point at which we know that blockchain infrastructure is by far the best way to run a distributed ledger. Then there's the discussion about the regulator's ability to impact Bitcoin, because they really don't have one. It's not something that they can police, and it ultimately doesn't really matter what they say about Bitcoin in terms of its legality. Obviously, if they make Bitcoin legal tender in a country and they enable a citizenry to pay taxes with it or service debt, then that changes the game for Bitcoin fundamentally. But what I mean is, if a legislator came out, for example, and said, look, it's illegal to use Bitcoin in our country, you're not allowed to, it would be an utterly meaningless step to take. And I'll give you an example that we're all familiar with in the world of media, right? With people downloading movies and TV shows from the internet without paying for them, for using technology like BitTorrent. Countries have made that outright illegal. You can go to prison in some for downloading content that you haven't paid for, and certainly for sharing it, which is the big thing that is policed. But that hasn't stopped it at all. In fact, it hasn't, I would say, had any meaningful impact on content piracy. And also, there's no victim, so it's a very difficult thing to prosecute, because Hollywood has had its best 10 years in history in terms of profits. So it's very hard to make the case that content piracy is hurting anybody when the people making the content are earning more money than ever before. So that's one example of where regulation would be utterly meaningless, because it can't be policed. And it would be similar in the Bitcoin world. If a government said Bitcoin is now illegal in our country, and even if they all did that, that's fine, but there's nothing they can do to stop it without turning off the internet. They don't have the power to police it. So it really doesn't matter what the regulators do. Regulators going to regulate. Now, I'm not dissing them. Like I'm a fan of some regulation. When I get into an airplane, I want to know that the pilot's got a license and that the airplane was serviced recently, and the people making sure that that's happening are a regulator, right? A civil aviation authority, for example. So some regulation is very good, and regulators have an important job to do. But really, I think all they can do in the Bitcoin space is think about what it means for their own activities, because it doesn't matter what your business is. There's an opportunity for you to use Bitcoin technology that's going to make it better. But in terms of what they do about Bitcoin, I think the best thing they can do is just get out of the way.
Oh, dear. And I have it under good authority that regulators in Kenya, that regulators in Nigeria do listen to this show, and and they've done exactly what you've just said. They've spent a lot of time and energy in the last sort of month or so circulating, notices saying that cryptocurrencies aren't legal tender, stay away. I believe Kenya's done something similar. Again, I totally take your point to why that probably is a waste of time on their part.
No. Let me clarify that, because there's some important nuances here. So yes, the regulator should be educating people about potential threats, for example. So right, there are some criminal groups like Triple M Global that run Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes in Africa, and are exploiting people and stealing money, to be quite frank. And they're doing this under the guise of cryptocurrency. Some of them are, anyway. For example, they're insisting that payment is made using Bitcoin, for example, or they've, in extreme cases, come up with their own scam cryptocurrency that isn't really a cryptocurrency, etc. In those cases, I feel the regulator stepping into the market and going, please be wary, please understand what you're putting your money into, etc. That's good work that regulators should be doing. Of course, there's a whole libertarian discussion to be had about, if people are stupid and want to give their money away, well, whose problem is that? But I'm not suggesting that regulators shouldn't be involved in that kind of activity. If they are going out and telling people to stay away from Bitcoin, well, that would depend on their reasoning. Unfortunately, it's usually just from an utter lack of understanding about how Bitcoin works and the technology involved. But it is a volatile store of value right now. So, I always tell people when they ask me, should I invest in Bitcoin? I go, well, only with money you can afford to lose, right? So you have to admit there is that volatility, etc. But what I mean more is in terms of coming out and taking a stance against Bitcoin as something that's illegal or dangerous, or it's ineffective because people are going to do it anyway. It can't be policed at a technology level. And so I would say to regulators, find out what's happening, find out about the third parties that are using Bitcoin to run, for example, these scams in your country, and look at how you can stop those third parties. Again, if somebody stabs another human being, we don't have a fight about whether or not knives should be made illegal. We talk about that human being and the problems, right? It's not the knife as a technology that has a problem and should be banned. And I think that's an important distinction that needs to be made.
Okay. Wow. You've definitely done a lot to sort of help me sort of frame my thinking around the issue. I suppose the issue with regulators on the continent typically is, I feel, and I can't use a blanket statement, but a lot of the time I sense that they're not speaking from a sort of informed point of view, in which case there's a knee-jerk protectionist attitude to sort of preserve legacy structures, you know what I mean? And it's not usually informed by what's best for the general populace in terms of where the future is taking us, but also it sometimes you sense that it's tinged with a self-interest, or at least an interest in keeping the incumbents happy, that kind of thing. And I think there's that, and then there's also everything you've just mentioned, the truth that we are dealing with an unprecedented set of technologies that are shaping the way we all conduct business, and we can't just approach it carelessly either, and without recognizing the dangers to citizens everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a very difficult time to be a regulator because firstly, you can't police these things. And secondly, the technology outpaces the regulation exponentially. It'll take some nerds a weekend to come up with something that regulators will take 3 years to even begin thinking about. Implementing regulation takes time. It's a very difficult era in which to be a regulator, and it's very difficult to give good advice to regulators as well. But it's foolish and short-sighted to say that they don't have a role to play. They absolutely do. I think the danger is that when there's a misunderstanding, and we've seen this in the American market repeatedly, regulators step in and actually do more damage than good because they don't understand the technology that they're regulating. That unfortunately does happen sometimes. The other thing that unfortunately happens is they enable a lot of crime through regulation, because some regulation, and especially if you look at tax regulation, makes it very easy for the bad guys to fly under the radar and make it look like they're complying, while on the other hand makes life difficult for the honest players who now have to spend man hours on massive amounts of pointless administration in their businesses so that they can prove that they're the good guys, while the bad guys are able to do business more easily than ever before. An example of that is RICA in South Africa, which is the system by which we register or associate names with SIM cards. It's the easiest thing in the world to game. And if you want to sell SIM cards in South Africa, it means that you need to have all sorts of infrastructure and compliance departments and things in place to make your business more difficult. If you're an honest South African who wants to get a SIM card, it's not as straightforward as just going to a store and buying one anymore. You have to produce an ID and a proof of residence, and it's laborious. Whereas, somebody with a fake passport from another African country can just go and buy a box of 10,000 SIM cards and have them rekeyed at once. And there's a lot of corruption in the systems, etc. So it's a difficult time to be a regulator, but I think they could also think more carefully about the impact their regulation is having and whether or not it's actually protecting anybody.
Right. Well, that's as good a place as any to end the show today. It's been absolutely a pleasure to have you on, man.
Yeah, dude, it's been great to chat to you again. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. But before you go, and before I say goodbye to you for the very last time, one more time, a big thank you to Alpha Code and VC for Africa for powering the upcoming African Tech Roundup live event happening in Sandton, Johannesburg on the morning of Thursday, March 16th. Now, for all the details on the event and for a link to apply, head straight to www.africantechroundup.com/live. And of course, if you're unable to join us on the day, do tune in live via our live stream at facebook.com/African Tech Roundup or facebook.com/VC for Africa. Now, that's it for this week. Again, the biggest thank you reserved once again for my guest this week. Easily one of the top 10 most intelligent people I have in my Rolodex.
Oh, stop.
Easily. Okay, maybe I have subcategories. Okay, so you're one of the top 10 fintech buffs in my Rolodex. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really, I always leave our conversations having learned so much more than I expected, and we must do this again.
Likewise, Andile. Always great chatting to you. Thank you very much.
For sure. And thank you for listening. Do join me again next week on africantechroundup.com. In the meantime, do follow us on Twitter and Instagram at African Roundup, or on Facebook at facebook.com/African Tech Roundup to keep yourself abreast of all the biggest news headlines as they happen. And of course, if you'd like to be part of the show, do send us a voice note via email. And the address is hello@africantechroundup.com. But for now, I'm Andile Masugu. Until next time, do take care, Africa.